The Fielding family was the picture of success. Jonathan Fielding, a towering figure in the legal world, commanded respect in every courtroom he entered. Known for his steely resolve and unrelenting drive, he had earned a reputation as the attorney you wanted on your side when the stakes were high. Outside of the office, his image as a doting father and dedicated husband completed the perfect narrative. The city admired him, colleagues envied him, and rivals begrudgingly respected him. But beneath the polished exterior, the truth was far less idyllic. At home, Jonathan was a man consumed by ambition. His focus on maintaining his professional dominance left little energy for the finer details of family life. While he remembered to send extravagant gifts for anniversaries and birthdays, he often missed the events themselves, tangled up in yet another high-profile case. His wife, Caroline, knew this routine well. She had once been captivated by his ambition, swept away by his promises of a life filled with success. Over time, those promises had come to feel like golden handcuffs. Caroline Fielding had mastered the art of appearances. At every gala, charity luncheon, or school event, she shone with effortless grace. The media adored her as the quintessential socialite, charming, elegant, and impeccably dressed. She took great care to craft this image, concealing the strains of a marriage that had grown colder with each passing year. Her smile could disarm a room, but in the quiet hours after the children were asleep, it often faded into something more brittle. Isabel and Liam, the Fielding children, were too young to understand the nuances of their parents' dynamic, but they felt the distance in their own ways. Isabel, 7 years old and wise beyond her years, had developed a knack for reading moods. She often acted as a peacemaker, sensing when her father's stress levels were high or when her mother's patience was fraying. Liam, 5 and full of boundless energy, still clung to the hope that each day might bring a moment of his father's attention. Jonathan's fleeting displays of affection, a tousle of the hair, a quick compliment, felt monumental to the little boy. Yet, those moments were few and far between. More often, Jonathan would bury himself in his home office, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows on the walls. The children learned early not to disturb him unless it was absolutely necessary. Caroline filled the gaps as best she could, hiring tutors, enrolling the kids in extracurriculars, and orchestrating playdates. But no number of activities could replace the longing in their eyes when they asked, "Will Dad be home for dinner tonight?" Caroline had her ways of coping. She busied herself with planning charity fundraisers and managing her social calendar, all while keeping up with the relentless pace of motherhood. To the outside world, she and Jonathan were a power couple, effortlessly juggling their roles. But inside the Fielding mansion, the cracks in their perfect facade grew wider by the day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose, Isabel sat on the window seat of her bedroom. She hugged her favorite stuffed bunny and stared out at the world beyond the gates of their estate. She didn't have the words to articulate her feelings, but she sensed something was missing. Her father's promises of "next time" felt like distant stars, visible but unreachable. Down the hall, Caroline prepared for yet another event. She stood before the gilded mirror in her dressing room, adjusting the clasp of a diamond necklace. The woman staring back at her looked polished, even radiant, but Caroline couldn't ignore the emptiness in her reflection. She sighed and reached for her lipstick, layering it on like armor. Jonathan emerged from his office, his phone glued to his ear. His voice was sharp, decisive, as he discussed strategies with a junior partner. Caroline glanced at him as he walked by, her expression unreadable. She waited until he ended the call before speaking. "Will you be joining us for dinner tomorrow? The kids would love to see you." Her tone was light, casual, but the question carried more weight than she let on. Jonathan didn't look up from his phone as he scrolled through emails. "I'll try, but no promises." Big meeting in the morning. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. She had heard that answer too many times before. As the evening wore on, the Fielding home settled into its familiar rhythm. Isabel tucked Liam into bed, reading him a story she had practically memorized by now. Caroline retreated to the quiet of her room, scrolling through social media feeds filled with smiling faces and family milestones. And Jonathan, as always, worked late into the night, the hum of his laptop filling the silence. The Fieldings' front door opened to reveal Natalie Bennett, a petite woman in her mid-20s with warm eyes and a reassuring smile. Her caramel-colored hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and the faintest hint of nervous excitement colored her features. She stood on the doorstep holding a modest leather bag, a striking contrast to the grandeur of the Fielding estate. Despite the polished surroundings, her presence felt natural, as though she belonged even before stepping inside. Caroline greeted her with a gracious smile, ushering her into the sprawling foyer. The children peeked around the corner, curious about the newcomer. Isabel, ever observant, was the first to approach. Her gaze swept over Natalie as if she were trying to decipher whether this stranger could be trusted. Liam followed close behind, less reserved, clutching his favorite toy truck. Natalie crouched down to their level and introduced herself with an easy warmth that put them both at ease. "You must be Isabel and Liam," she said. "I've heard so many wonderful things about you." Isabel tilted her head, scrutinizing her. "You're the new nanny?" "That's right," Natalie replied. "And I think we're going to have a lot of fun together." Liam grinned. "Do you like playing hide and seek?" "I love it," Natalie answered without hesitation. "But I'm pretty good at finding hiding spots, so you'll have to get creative." Caroline watched the interaction unfold, relief flickering across her face. She had been nervous about finding the right person for this role, someone who could provide the stability her children needed while seamlessly fitting into their unusual household dynamic. Natalie seemed to embody exactly what she had hoped for. Natalie's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. A college student juggling a rigorous academic schedule and part-time jobs, she had applied for the nanny position out of necessity. The ad had stood out, a live-in role with competitive pay, ideal for someone balancing responsibilities. She hadn't expected to hear back, but when Caroline called to arrange an interview, Natalie knew she had to make a strong impression. During the meeting, Caroline was struck by her calm demeanor and the quiet confidence she exuded. Unlike other candidates who had recited rehearsed answers, Natalie spoke candidly about her love for working with children and her aspirations to become an educator. Her genuine approach resonated with Caroline, who had grown tired of people trying to impress her with grandiose claims. By the end of the interview, Caroline felt certain she had found the right person. Jonathan, however, was less convinced. He barely acknowledged Natalie's presence when Caroline introduced her as the new nanny. His handshake was perfunctory, his expression impassive. He muttered something polite before retreating to his office, leaving Natalie to navigate the intricacies of her new role without his involvement. "She seems fine," Jonathan had said to Caroline later that evening, his tone dismissive. "But we don't need her getting too comfortable. Just make sure she does her job." Caroline had brushed off his remarks, choosing to focus on the positives. Her instincts told her that Natalie was exactly what the children needed, and she wasn't about to let Jonathan's skepticism interfere. Natalie settled into the household quickly, her natural charm winning over Isabel and Liam within days. She introduced new routines, transforming mealtimes and bedtime rituals into moments of connection. She read stories with vivid animation, eliciting giggles and gasps from the children, and joined them in building elaborate pillow forts that filled the living room with laughter. For Isabel, Natalie's presence felt like a breath of fresh air. She admired how the nanny always took her thoughts seriously, listening intently and asking questions as though Isabel's opinions truly mattered. For Liam, Natalie became a source of unfiltered joy. He delighted in the way she joined his games wholeheartedly, never treating his imaginative adventures as trivial. Caroline watched these interactions with quiet gratitude. She noticed how the children's eyes lit up around Natalie, how their laughter seemed freer, less guarded. It was as though Natalie had unlocked a part of them that had been tucked away for safekeeping. But not everyone shared this sentiment. Jonathan remained distant, his interactions with Natalie limited to polite nods and curt instructions. He rarely looked up from his phone or laptop when she was in the room, giving the impression that her presence barely registered. One evening, as Natalie helped Liam clean up his scattered toys, Jonathan appeared in the doorway. His tone was brisk, his words directed more at Caroline than at Natalie. "Are we certain she can handle this? These kids need discipline, not someone playing games all day." Natalie paused, taken aback by his bluntness. Caroline stepped in quickly, her voice firm but measured. "Natalie is doing a wonderful job, Jonathan. The children adore her, and I've seen nothing but positive changes since she started." Jonathan's gaze flicked to Natalie, his expression unreadable. "We'll see," he said before turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. The tension lingered long after he left the room. Natalie felt a pang of self-doubt but quickly pushed it aside. Her focus was on Isabel and Liam, who needed her unwavering support, regardless of their father's reservations. The days turned into weeks, and Natalie's bond with the children deepened. She helped Isabel prepare for her school's spelling bee, practicing words late into the evening until Isabel felt confident. She coaxed Liam out of a tantrum with gentle humor, teaching him how to articulate his feelings instead of lashing out. Despite Jonathan's initial skepticism, even he couldn't ignore the subtle changes in the household. The children seemed happier, more secure. Caroline seemed less stressed, her smiles more genuine. Though he still kept Natalie at arm's length, there were moments when his disapproval softened, moments he would never admit to anyone, not even himself. Natalie remained focused on her role, refusing to let Jonathan's aloofness overshadow her purpose. She had come to the Fielding household to make a difference, and every hug from Liam and every proud smile from Isabel reminded her that she was exactly where she needed to be. The Fielding household began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Natalie's presence brought a warmth that Isabel and Liam had longed for, even if they couldn't put it into words. Afternoons were now filled with bursts of creativity, finger painting on the patio, baking cookies that sometimes ended in flower fights, and scavenger hunts in the garden where their giggles carried through the air like music. Isabel, who had always been more reserved, blossomed under Natalie's encouragement. When Natalie suggested they write a play together, Isabel threw herself into the project, carefully crafting a script and even designing costumes. Liam, on the other hand, found an endless source of adventure in Natalie. She never dismissed his ideas, no matter how wild they seemed. When he decided he wanted to build a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes, Natalie not only helped him gather materials but also sat inside the makeshift cockpit, pretending they were blasting off to the moon. These moments made Liam feel seen in a way he hadn't before, and he began to ask for Natalie's opinion on everything from his Lego creations to which superhero was the strongest. Caroline noticed the changes immediately. There was less tension in the air, fewer tantrums from Liam, and a newfound confidence in Isabel's demeanor. For the first time in a long while, the house felt more like a home. Caroline often found herself pausing in the middle of her tasks to simply watch Natalie with the children, her heart swelling with gratitude. But even amidst these positive changes, there were moments of unease when she saw how Jonathan remained unchanged. Natalie had a knack for observing without drawing attention to herself. It didn't take long for her to notice the fissures in Jonathan's polished exterior. His interactions with the children were brief, often staged for photos he would post online with captions like, "Family time is the best time." Isabel and Liam played along, smiling dutifully for the camera, but once the lens was put away, Jonathan's attention would shift back to his phone or laptop. Natalie also noticed the way Jonathan spoke to Caroline, curt, transactional, as though she were a business partner rather than his wife. One evening, as Natalie cleaned up after dinner, she overheard them in the dining room. Caroline had suggested they all take a weekend trip to the lake house, something she thought might bring them closer as a family. Jonathan's response was as dismissive as it was predictable. "You know my schedule, Caroline. I can't just drop everything for a spontaneous getaway. Caroline's voice was measured, but there was a weariness beneath it. It's not spontaneous, Jonathan. I've been asking you about this for weeks. And I've been busy, he replied, barely glancing up from his phone. Natalie busied herself with stacking dishes, pretending not to hear. But the exchange lingered in her mind, another piece of the puzzle that made up the Fieldings' fragile dynamic. She felt a growing frustration toward Jonathan, though she kept it to herself, focusing instead on the positive changes she could make for the children. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Isabel curled up on the couch with Natalie, flipping through a picture book they had just read. As Natalie reached over to close her bag, a corner of a textbook peeked out, its title partially obscured. Isabel's sharp eyes caught it immediately. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Natalie hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the zipper. "Oh, it's just some boring stuff for school," she said lightly, quickly tucking the book away. Isabel's curiosity only deepened. "What kind of school? Are you a student?" Natalie smiled, ruffling Isabel's hair playfully. "Sort of. I'm just studying a little on the side. Nothing exciting." "Is it hard?" Isabel pressed, her brow furrowing. "It can be," Natalie admitted. "But it's good to challenge yourself, right?" Isabel nodded thoughtfully, but Natalie could tell her mind was still turning. She made a mental note to be more discreet in the future, knowing the last thing she wanted was for her personal life to overshadow the focus she had placed on the children. Later that night, as the house fell quiet, Natalie sat in her room, the faint hum of rain against the windows her only companion. She pulled out the textbook Isabel had noticed earlier and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages with a mix of determination and exhaustion. Her fingers traced the underlined passages, the notes scribbled in the margins. This was her secret, the part of herself she kept tucked away from everyone in the Fielding household. Natalie wasn't just a nanny. She was also a law student, working tirelessly toward a degree that represented the dreams she had been chasing for years. It was a path she had chosen with unwavering resolve, though it meant sacrifices she rarely spoke of. Balancing her studies with her responsibilities to the Fielding family wasn't easy, but Natalie thrived on the challenge. What she hadn't anticipated was how much she would come to care for Isabel and Liam, or how much she would find herself quietly rooting for Caroline, a woman who seemed to be navigating her own silent battles. As the rain softened into a gentle patter, Natalie closed her book and leaned back in her chair. Her thoughts drifted to Isabel's inquisitive expression and Liam's boundless energy. They deserved more than what they had been given, and Natalie was determined to be a positive force in their lives for as long as she could. Down the hall, Caroline stood by the window in her bedroom, watching the rain trail down the glass. She thought about the small moments of joy Natalie had brought to the household, the way the children had blossomed under her care. A quiet hope stirred in her heart, a hope that perhaps things could still change, that the threads of their family could be rewoven. But as she glanced at Jonathan, who was already asleep, his phone still clutched in his hand, she felt the weight of reality settle over her once more. Natalie, too, felt the heaviness of the Fielding family's unspoken struggles, but she wasn't one to back away from challenges. As she turned off the light and settled into bed, she resolved to keep doing what she could, one small moment, one shared laugh, one act of kindness at a time. Jonathan stood in the center of the living room, surveying the preparations with a critical eye. Every detail had been meticulously planned to impress his law firm partners, the floral arrangements, the imported wine, even the custom-printed menus featuring a 5-course meal. The penthouse was transformed into a glittering stage, with Jonathan cast as the leading man in a performance he had rehearsed his entire life. For him, the dinner party wasn't just a social gathering, it was an opportunity to solidify his standing and remind everyone why he was at the top. Caroline leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the flurry of activity around her. The caterers bustled in and out, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres while the housekeeper polished the already gleaming surfaces. She was no stranger to this routine, having hosted countless events over the years. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier. The perfection Jonathan demanded came at a cost, and more often than not, it was Caroline who paid the price. "It's just one night," Jonathan said earlier, brushing off her concerns about the children's bedtime routine being disrupted. "Everything needs to be flawless. You can manage that, right?" Caroline had bitten back her response, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. She had long since mastered the art of swallowing her frustrations and smiling through her discontent. Still, as she adjusted the angle of a centerpiece for the third time, she felt a flicker of resentment. Her life had become an endless cycle of managing appearances, ensuring every event, every interaction, reflected the image Jonathan was so determined to maintain. "Caroline, could you make sure the wine glasses are arranged properly?" Jonathan's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and demanding. He barely looked up from his phone as he spoke, his focus already elsewhere. "They're fine, Jonathan," she replied evenly. "I've checked twice." Natalie entered the room, carrying Liam on her hip and Isabel trailing behind her. The children had been curious about the commotion all afternoon, drawn to the unfamiliar energy buzzing through the penthouse. "Mom, why are there so many plates?" Isabel asked, her wide eyes darting toward the long dining table adorned with crystal and silver. "We're having some guests over for dinner," Caroline explained, her tone light but distracted. "It's a special night for Daddy." Liam wriggled in Natalie's arms, craning his neck to see more. "Can we come to the dinner?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Not tonight, sweetheart," Caroline said gently. "You'll have dinner in the playroom with Natalie." Natalie smiled reassuringly at the children. "We're going to have our own little party," she said, her enthusiasm sparking immediate interest. "How about pizza and a movie?" Isabel's face lit up, and even Liam seemed placated by the idea. Natalie's ability to diffuse situations like this was one of the reasons Caroline had come to rely on her so heavily. Later, as the evening drew closer, Caroline pulled Natalie aside. "I know this is asking a lot, but could you stay late tonight? Just until the party is over. I'll make sure you're compensated." "Of course," Natalie replied without hesitation. "I'm happy to help." Caroline placed a hand on Natalie's arm, her expression softening. "Thank you. I don't know how I'd manage without you." The hours leading up to the dinner party were a whirlwind of activity. Caterers moved in synchronized precision, setting out trays of elaborate hors d'oeuvres and filling crystal glasses with sparkling water. The scent of roasted lamb and truffle risotto filled the air as chefs plated dishes with artistic flair. The penthouse shimmered under the glow of soft lighting, its polished floors reflecting every gleam of the meticulously arranged decor. Jonathan, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of success, surveyed the scene with a critical eye. Every detail had to be flawless, down to the way the napkins were folded. Natalie lingered near the children's playroom, keeping Isabel and Liam occupied while the preparations unfolded. Her role for the evening had been clearly outlined by Jonathan. "You're welcome to stay, but don't linger where you're not needed," he had said earlier, his tone as cool as always. "This is an important night. Stay out of the way." She had nodded, biting back a response. It wasn't the first time Jonathan had dismissed her, and she doubted it would be the last. But as long as Isabel and Liam needed her, she would tolerate his dismissive attitude. Caroline appeared in the hallway, her dress a flowing emerald green that complemented her delicate features. She paused, her hand lightly grazing the back of a chair as she glanced around. The tension in her shoulders was barely masked by her composed smile. When her eyes met Natalie's, her expression softened. "Thank you for helping with the kids," Caroline said quietly. "Jonathan can be particular about nights like this." Natalie offered a small smile. "Of course. They're excited for our pizza party later." Caroline's lips curved, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Sometimes I wonder who all this is really for, she said under her breath, gesturing to the extravagance surrounding them. It's certainly not for us. Before Natalie could respond, Jonathan appeared at Caroline's side, his commanding presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. He barely glanced at Natalie before addressing Caroline. The partners will be here soon. Is everything ready? Caroline nodded, her voice steady despite the subtle edge in his question. Everything is exactly as you planned. Good, Jonathan replied curtly, before disappearing toward the dining area to make final adjustments. As the evening progressed, guests began to arrive, their laughter and greetings filling the space. Jonathan was in his element, shaking hands and exchanging confident nods with his colleagues. Natalie stayed close to the children, ensuring they didn't disrupt the carefully curated scene. Isabel and Liam watched the bustle with wide eyes, intrigued by the unfamiliar faces and sparkling outfits. At one point, Natalie ventured into the kitchen to grab drinks for the children. She paused near the doorway, her ears catching fragments of a conversation. Jonathan's voice rose above the others, his tone laced with pride as he spoke to a small group of men in dark suits. Running a firm like ours takes more than just skill, it takes discipline, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. You can't let distractions derail your focus. My family understands that. One of the men chuckled. Sounds like you've got everything figured out, Jonathan. Jonathan smirked, raising his glass slightly. It's all about balance. A successful career, a perfect home, it's not easy, but I make it work. Natalie's grip tightened on the juice bottles she held, her stomach twisting at the words. Perfect home? The phrase echoed in her mind, a stark contrast to what she had witnessed behind the scenes. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but she couldn't seem to move. Another voice chimed in. Your wife must have her hands full keeping up with it all. Jonathan laughed, a sound that felt too sharp, too hollow. Caroline handles things beautifully. She knows her role, and I make sure she has everything she needs. Natalie's chest tightened. The casual way he spoke about Caroline, as though she were an accessory to his success, made her blood simmer. She wanted to step in, to challenge the narrative he so easily constructed, but she knew it wasn't her place. She turned and left the kitchen before she could hear more, her mind racing. When she returned to the playroom, Isabel looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Is the party fun? She asked. Natalie forced a smile, kneeling beside the little girl. It's very grown up, she said lightly. I think our party is way more exciting. Isabel giggled, leaning against her. I like our party better too. Liam chimed in, waving a slice of pizza. We're the best. Natalie hugged them both, their innocent joy grounding her swirling thoughts. She wanted to shield them from the pressures and pretenses that seemed to consume their father's world. These moments of laughter, of simple connection, were what truly mattered, and she was determined to preserve them for as long as she could. As the evening wore on, Caroline drifted back toward the playroom. She stood in the doorway, watching Natalie read to the children. Her posture relaxed slightly, the weight of the evening momentarily lifting. When Natalie noticed her, she smiled, motioning for her to join them. Caroline shook her head. I can't stay. But seeing them like this, it's a reminder of what's real. Natalie nodded, her eyes full of understanding. They're amazing kids. They are, Caroline said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. I just hope they never lose that. The quiet exchange hung in the air as Caroline returned to the party, her presence once again transformed into that of the perfect hostess. Natalie watched her go, her admiration for the woman growing. Despite the constraints of her world, Caroline managed to hold on to a quiet strength that Natalie couldn't help but respect. Natalie helped Isabel and Liam settle into bed, their excitement from the day finally giving way to exhaustion. As she tucked them in, Isabel reached for her hand. "You're the best nanny ever," she murmured sleepily, her words melting Natalie's heart. "Good night, Isabel," Natalie whispered, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "Sweet dreams." The evening was winding down, but Jonathan was still in full showman mode, basking in the admiration of his colleagues. The wine flowed freely, and the conversation had taken on a more relaxed tone. Jonathan, seated at the head of the long dining table, leaned back with the air of someone fully in control, his confidence amplified by the success of the evening. His voice carried easily across the room as he recounted a particularly difficult case he had won earlier that year, weaving the tale with all the flair of a practiced storyteller. Natalie lingered by the entryway, quietly observing as she collected empty glasses from the side tables. The children were asleep, the playroom tidied, and she was ready to slip away for the night. But as she moved toward the kitchen, Jonathan's voice caught her attention. "Natalie," he called, his tone unmistakably performative. "You've been hovering in the background all evening. Why don't you join us for a moment?" Natalie froze, her instincts warning her this wasn't a genuine invitation. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Jonathan's. His smile was thin, his gaze sharp. "I was just telling my colleagues about the complexities of contract law," he said, gesturing toward her with his wine glass. "Tell me, since you've been working here, have you picked up anything about the subject?" The room chuckled lightly, sensing the edge in his question. Natalie's grip on the glasses tightened, but she maintained her composure. Caroline, seated to Jonathan's left, looked up from her plate, her brow furrowing slightly as she caught the undertone in his words. "I can't say it's come up in my day-to-day duties," Natalie replied, her voice calm. "Why do you ask?" Jonathan smirked, leaning forward as though setting the stage for a punchline. "I'm curious. Let's see what you'd do with a hypothetical situation. If a client breaches a confidentiality agreement but claims they were coerced into signing it, how might you approach the defense?" Natalie felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. It was clear he expected her to flounder, to stumble over an answer that would reinforce his narrative. But instead of shrinking back, she set the glasses on the nearest table and stepped fully into the room. "Well," she began, her voice steady, "coercion would fall under duress in contract law, which invalidates the agreement if it can be proven. The first step would be to examine the circumstances under which the contract was signed. Were there explicit threats, or was there undue influence exerted by the other party? If the coercion claim holds, the confidentiality clause might be voided." The room fell silent. Jonathan's smirk faltered as he sat up straighter, clearly caught off guard. His colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to genuine interest. Natalie continued, her tone even and confident. "That said, a skilled attorney would also consider whether there's evidence contradicting the coercion claim. Documentation, timelines, and witness testimony could all play a role in countering the argument. It's rarely black and white." She allowed a pause, letting her words settle. Then, with a faint smile, she added, "But of course, you'd know all of this already." A ripple of surprised murmurs swept through the room. One of the partners, an older man with a kind face, leaned forward. "That's an excellent analysis. Where did you study?" "Oh, I'm not a lawyer," Natalie said casually, retrieving the glasses she had set down. "I'm just a nanny, who happens to be studying law at community college." The room erupted into astonished exclamations. Jonathan's colleagues turned to him, their expressions ranging from impressed to amused. Caroline, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing interest, suddenly let out a laugh, loud, genuine, and utterly unrestrained. She covered her mouth, trying to stifle it, but it was too late. The sound filled the room, breaking through the tension like sunlight through a storm. "Jonathan," Caroline said between giggles, her voice tinged with amusement. "It seems you've underestimated Natalie." Natalie glanced at Caroline, her expression softening at the unexpected show of support. Meanwhile, Jonathan's face darkened, the corners of his mouth tightening as he struggled to regain control of the moment. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh, "it seems I've hired someone with hidden talents." "Hidden talents?" Caroline repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Jonathan, she just gave a better answer than half the lawyers I've met at these parties. You should be taking notes." The room laughed again, this time more warmly, the earlier tension replaced by genuine admiration for Natalie's poise. One of the younger associates leaned toward her, clearly intrigued. "What year are you in?" "Second," Natalie replied, keeping her tone light. "Still a lot to learn, but I'm enjoying the challenge." "I'd say you're off to a great start," the associate said, nodding appreciatively. Jonathan's grip on his wine glass tightened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. The conversation around the table shifted, the attention on Natalie gradually diffusing as the guests turned back to their drinks and desserts. But the impact of the moment lingered, the room subtly changed by her unexpected presence. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Caroline found Natalie in the kitchen, where she was rinsing the last of the glasses. Caroline leaned against the counter, her emerald dress catching the light. "That was brilliant," Caroline said, her voice low but full of warmth. "You completely floored them." Natalie glanced over, a modest smile on her lips. "I wasn't trying to cause a scene." Caroline shook her head. "You didn't. You just reminded everyone, including Jonathan, that there's more to you than they realize." Natalie hesitated, then said, "Thank you for laughing. It made everything less awkward." Caroline's smile widened, and for a moment, the two women shared a quiet understanding. "You've given me the best laugh I've had in months," Caroline said. "I should be thanking you." Natalie chuckled softly, returning to her task as Caroline left the kitchen. Alone again, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on what had just happened. She hadn't intended to upstage Jonathan, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of holding her own in a room that had clearly underestimated her. It wasn't the accolades or the attention that mattered, it was the quiet reminder to herself that she belonged, no matter where she was. The last of the guests had gone, their voices and laughter fading as the elevator doors closed. The penthouse was eerily quiet now, the remnants of the evening scattered across the living room, a half-empty wine bottle on the table, forgotten napkins on the floor, and a faint hum of tension in the air. Jonathan stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the city skyline. His shoulders were stiff, his hands gripping his glass so tightly it seemed like it might shatter. Natalie emerged from the kitchen with her purse and coat in her arms, ready to go home. She glanced at Caroline, who was seated on the couch, her emerald dress slightly rumpled, her heels kicked off to the side. Caroline looked weary but calm, her focus on Jonathan as though she were bracing for something inevitable. "I hope you're proud of yourself," Jonathan said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Natalie paused mid-step, unsure if he was addressing her or Caroline. "You just couldn't resist, could you?" Jonathan continued, turning to face them. His gaze landed squarely on Caroline. "Laughing like that, encouraging her. You made me look like a fool in front of my colleagues." Caroline's expression didn't change. She folded her arms, meeting his glare with a calm defiance. "You did that all on your own, Jonathan." He scoffed, the sound bitter and incredulous. "I was trying to entertain, to keep the evening light. And instead, I was blindsided in my own home." Natalie's jaw tightened. She had expected Jonathan's arrogance, but the venom in his tone still stung. "With all due respect, Mr. Fielding," she said evenly, "you're the one who put me on the spot. I wasn't trying to show you up." Jonathan turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, spare me the righteous act. I don't need lectures from the nanny." "Jonathan." Caroline snapped, her voice firm and cutting. "That's enough." But Jonathan wasn't finished. "You think because you can spout a few legal terms, you belong in the conversation? Let me remind you, you're here to look after my children, not to humiliate me. Natalie took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had endured his dismissiveness before, but this was different. It was personal now, and she wasn't going to stand for it. You're right, she said, her tone calm but resolute. I am here for Isabel and Liam. And they're the only reason I've put up with this. Jonathan's expression flickered, surprise breaking through his anger for a brief moment. Natalie turned to Caroline, her gaze softening. I'm sorry, Mrs. Fielding. I love your children more than I can say, but I can't stay here anymore. Caroline's face fell, a mix of disappointment and understanding washing over her. Natalie, please. I've made up my mind, Natalie interrupted gently. Thank you for trusting me with them. They're incredible kids, and they deserve so much more than this. Without waiting for a response, Natalie walked toward the door. Caroline stood, her movements slow and deliberate as she turned to face Jonathan. This is exactly what I mean, Jonathan, she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. You push people away. You treat everyone like they're beneath you, like they exist solely to prop you up. And for what? Your career? Your ego? Because it's certainly not for this family. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Caroline took a step closer, her voice rising. Do you have any idea how tired I am? Of smiling through your dismissiveness? Of cleaning up the messes you leave behind while you're too busy posturing for people who don't care about you beyond what you can do for them? His eyes flickered with something unspoken, but Caroline didn't let him speak. When we met, you were ambitious, yes, but you cared. You cared about people, about me. Somewhere along the way, you stopped. You started treating me like part of your image, not a person. And now, I'm not sure I even know who you are. Jonathan's voice finally broke through, quiet but laced with frustration. Caroline, this is unfair. Unfair, she repeated, her voice incredulous. Unfair is how you treat your own children. They barely know you, Jonathan. You're a stranger to them, a shadow they hope might one day notice them. And when they grow up, do you think they'll admire you? Or will they resent you for not being there? He winced at her words, but she pressed on. You're so obsessed with being perfect for everyone else, but this family is falling apart. And you're too blind to see it. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as though the words he wanted to say wouldn't come. Caroline took a shaky breath, her voice softer now but no less firm. I've thought about leaving, Jonathan. More times than I can count. His head snapped up at this, his expression shifting from anger to alarm. I haven't, because I keep hoping the man I married is still in there somewhere. But tonight, watching you tear down someone like Natalie just to soothe your ego? I realized I can't keep waiting. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice faltering. Caroline, She held up a hand, stopping him. I don't need an apology, Jonathan. I need change. And if you can't give me that, then I need to walk away, for me, and for the kids. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice low. Do you really mean it? About leaving? Caroline looked at him, her gaze steady. I do. But it's not too late. Not yet. He nodded slowly, the gravity of her words settling over him like a cold wind. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan Fielding felt uncertain, and perhaps, that was exactly what he needed. The weight of Caroline's words stayed with Jonathan long after she retreated to their bedroom. The penthouse, now silent, felt cavernous and cold, its polished surfaces reflecting the hollow perfection he had worked so tirelessly to maintain. He sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the city lights casting fragmented patterns across the walls. His thoughts churned, uncomfortably sharp and unrelenting. For the first time in years, Jonathan Fielding was forced to confront himself, not the public persona, not the flawless attorney, but the man he had become. He thought about the dinner party, the carefully orchestrated event meant to bolster his image. Instead, it had revealed the very flaws he had worked so hard to conceal. He replayed Natalie's poised response to his petty attempt at humiliation and the quiet dignity with which she had endured his arrogance. Most of all, he heard Caroline's voice, her pointed truths cutting through his defenses with unerring precision. By morning, Jonathan had made a decision. It wasn't enough to feel regret, he needed to act. His first step was reaching out to Natalie. He left a voicemail, his tone uncharacteristically humble, asking if she could meet him at his office later that day. He didn't reveal the full scope of his plan, knowing she might refuse if she fully understood what he intended. At the law firm, the atmosphere was as charged as ever. Associates hurried between offices, juggling briefs and court schedules, while partners reviewed contracts in glass-walled conference rooms. Jonathan had called an unscheduled meeting with the firm's senior team, raising eyebrows and stirring curiosity. The partners arrived promptly, their expressions a mix of interest and confusion. Natalie entered the office shortly after, her expression cautious but composed. She wore a simple blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. It was a far cry from her usual attire at the Fielding household, but it suited her. She looked every bit as capable and determined as she had sounded the night before. "Mr. Fielding," she greeted, her tone polite but distant. "You asked to see me?" Jonathan rose from his seat at the head of the conference table, gesturing for her to sit. "Natalie, thank you for coming. I realize this is unexpected." She hesitated but took the chair nearest the door, her posture guarded. The partners exchanged glances, their curiosity deepening. Jonathan took a steadying breath, then addressed the room. "Before we begin, I want to explain why I called this meeting. Last night, at the dinner party, I behaved in a way that was unprofessional and frankly unacceptable. My actions were rooted in arrogance, and I allowed my ego to overshadow my judgment." Natalie's eyes widened slightly, though she remained silent. The partners looked at one another, clearly intrigued. "I directed that behavior at Natalie," Jonathan continued, his gaze meeting hers directly. "I attempted to demean her in front of my colleagues, assuming she wouldn't be able to rise to the challenge I unfairly imposed. Not only was I wrong, but I was also deeply disrespectful. And for that, Natalie, I owe you an apology." The room fell silent. Natalie blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Fielding, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jonathan replied. "But I want you to know that I mean this. I've spent too much time focused on maintaining an image, on projecting strength, without considering how my actions affect the people around me. That needs to change." One of the senior partners, a woman named Evelyn, leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Jonathan, this is unexpected. But I'm glad to see you owning up to your behavior. It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong." Jonathan nodded, then turned back to Natalie. "You deserve more than just an apology, though. Your response last night demonstrated intelligence, composure, and a deep understanding of the law. It's clear you have an extraordinary future ahead of you, and I want to support that." Natalie tilted her head, skepticism flickering across her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'd like to offer you an internship here at the firm," Jonathan said. "It would be part-time, allowing you to continue your studies, and it would give you access to the resources and mentorship you deserve. I see your potential, and I believe in it." The room murmured again, this time with a mix of surprise and approval. Natalie's expression shifted from disbelief to something softer, though she still seemed hesitant. "Mr. Fielding," she began, her voice measured, "I don't know if I can accept. After everything that happened, this feels complicated." Jonathan nodded, his tone earnest. I understand. This offer isn't about erasing what happened, it's about making amends in a way that reflects your worth. You're under no obligation to say yes, but I hope you'll consider it. Natalie sat back, her mind clearly racing. She glanced around the room, noting the genuine interest on the faces of the partners. Finally, she looked back at Jonathan, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said after a long pause. "I'll need some time to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Jonathan replied, relief softening his features. "The offer stands whenever you're ready." Natalie nodded and stood, her composure intact despite the whirlwind of emotions clearly brewing beneath the surface. "I appreciate the opportunity, and the apology." As she left the room, the partners turned their attention back to Jonathan. Evelyn was the first to speak, her tone laced with approval. "I have to say, Jonathan, this is the most human I've ever seen you. It's a good look." Jonathan managed a faint smile, though his thoughts were still on Natalie. The room began to clear as the partners returned to their schedules, leaving Jonathan alone in the conference room. He exhaled deeply, the weight of the morning pressing against him. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to feel vulnerable, but he knew this was a step in the right direction. Natalie walked through the bustling halls of the firm, her thoughts racing. She hadn't expected Jonathan's apology, let alone the offer. The sincerity in his words had caught her off guard, and she couldn't deny the potential opportunity it represented. Still, trust wasn't something she could give lightly, not after everything. As she stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, Natalie found herself standing at a crossroads. The choice ahead wasn't just about an internship, it was about whether she believed in the possibility of real change, not just for Jonathan, but for herself. And though the answer wasn't clear yet, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't expected. Natalie sat at her modest desk in a quiet corner of the Fielding law firm, the weight of her decision slowly giving way to excitement. Accepting the internship hadn't been an easy choice. Her love for Isabel and Liam made leaving her nanny role bittersweet, but she knew this opportunity was too valuable to pass up. The transition was smooth. She still visited the children often, sometimes bringing small surprises for their playdates while she adjusted to her new world. Her first days as an intern were challenging but exhilarating, and the feeling of finally stepping into the career she'd been dreaming of made the long nights of studying worthwhile. At the Fielding household, change was also underway. Caroline, true to her commitment to find someone exceptional for the children, began interviewing potential nannies. This time, Jonathan joined her for every conversation. He asked thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in how each candidate would approach nurturing Isabel and Liam. For the first time in years, Caroline saw a version of Jonathan she thought might have disappeared, a man who wasn't just invested in his image but was beginning to truly invest in his family. When Caroline found a promising candidate, a warm and creative young woman named Becca, it was Jonathan who sealed the deal. "You seem to understand how important it is to be present for them," he said during the interview, surprising even Caroline. "They need someone who truly sees them." Becca started the following week, and it didn't take long for her to win over the children with her artistic flair and genuine kindness. Just as the household began finding its new rhythm, Jonathan made an announcement over dinner one night that left everyone stunned. "We're going on a family vacation," he declared, setting down his fork. "Just the four of us." Isabel's eyes widened with excitement, and Liam clapped his hands. "Where are we going?" he asked eagerly. Jonathan smiled, glancing at Caroline. "I thought we could go to the lake house. It's been too long, and it'll give us a chance to spend some real time together." Caroline's initial surprise softened into cautious hope. The lake house was where they had shared some of their happiest memories before life grew so complicated. It wasn't just the idea of the trip that touched her, it was the fact that Jonathan had planned it himself, with no ulterior motive beyond reconnecting with his family. The drive to the lake house was filled with chatter and laughter, a stark contrast to the strange silence that used to dominate family car rides. Jonathan and Caroline took turns playing silly games with the children, and even Liam's boundless energy couldn't wear down their spirits. By the time they arrived, the sight of the familiar cabin nestled among the trees brought smiles to everyone's faces. The days that followed were simple but transformative. Jonathan took Isabel fishing, patiently teaching her how to cast her line while Liam helped Caroline gather wildflowers by the shore. In the evenings, they played board games by the fireplace, the sound of their laughter filling the cabin. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't checking his phone or taking calls during meals. Instead, he was present, listening, engaging, and showing his family the side of himself they had almost forgotten. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, Jonathan and Caroline sat on the porch, watching the stars reflect on the still water. Jonathan reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "I know I have a long way to go," he said quietly. "But I want you to know I'm trying. For us, for the kids. I'm trying to be the man you deserve." Caroline turned to him, her expression softening. "I can see that," she said, her voice gentle. "And it means more than you know." The trip became a turning point, not just for Jonathan but for the entire family. Back at home, Jonathan continued making small but meaningful changes, taking Isabel to school, attending Liam's soccer games, and setting aside time every evening for family dinners. Caroline, seeing his efforts, began to let go of some of the resentment she had carried for so long. Slowly but surely, the emotional distance that had once defined their marriage began to fade. Months later, Natalie stood on the stage at her law school graduation, her name ringing out as she walked across to accept her diploma. The applause was thunderous, and when she looked out into the crowd, her heart swelled at the sight of her parents, siblings, and a few familiar faces from the Fielding family. Caroline waved enthusiastically, while Jonathan offered a polite but genuine smile. Isabel and Liam cheered the loudest, their voices cutting through the noise. After the ceremony, Natalie made her way through the crowd, her diploma clutched tightly in her hands. When she reached the Fieldings, she was met with hugs from the children and a warm embrace from Caroline. Jonathan stepped forward last, his hand outstretched. "Congratulations, Natalie," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "You've worked hard, and you've earned every bit of this." "Thank you," she replied, shaking his hand. He hesitated, then added, "I also want to thank you. Not just for what you did for my children, but for the lessons you taught me. You've made me a better man, and I'll always be grateful for that." Natalie blinked, touched by his words. "I think you taught yourself that, Mr. Fielding." "I just held up the mirror." The moment was brief but profound, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. Natalie's career began to take shape soon after. The law firm, impressed by her intelligence and dedication, offered her a permanent position as a junior lawyer. Her first day in her new role felt surreal, the culmination of years of perseverance and sacrifice. As she settled into her new office, she pinned a small photo to the corkboard above her desk, a picture of her with Isabel and Liam on one of their last playdates. It was a reminder of where she started and the people who had shaped her journey. Back at the Fielding household, life was far from perfect, but it was undeniably better. Jonathan continued his efforts to prioritize his family, and Caroline found herself smiling more often, her hope renewed. The children thrived, their laughter once again a constant presence in the home. Natalie's story had intertwined with theirs for a time, leaving an indelible mark. And as they each moved forward on their separate paths, there was a shared understanding that sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places.